Well, good morning. My name is Josh. I'm the lead pastor here at Verve City Church. Before we jump into our message today, I just want to let you know about something coming up this Wednesday, August 21st, 7 to 8:30 p.m. We're having a VIP night, a Verve Important Person Night. If you call Verve City Church your home, we would love for you to try to make every effort to be here this Wednesday night. We're kind of having a family meeting. We're going to have some conversation, some exciting vision casting about the next several years, and some exciting things that are coming up this fall that we would love to give you and your family an opportunity to participate in. So that's coming up this Wednesday. We're going to start sharp at 7, so if you have children and you need childcare, that is provided. If you could get here a little early, before 7 to check them in, that would be greatly appreciated. And we'd invite you to register for it as well. You can register for it on our homepage, or if you forget to do that, you can still show up. It's okay. We'll have a seat for you. It's just helpful for us to get a count, especially if you have children, so we know how many childcare providers to provide. So that's this Wednesday, August 21st, 7 to 8:30 p.m. Again, if you call Verve City Church your home, it'd mean a great deal to me if you would try to be here, because I'm really looking forward to it and going to do some celebrating together that night as well and some worship. All right, we're in a series called The Lost World of the Bible Origins. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to look back through the first 11 chapters of the Bible, the very first 11 chapters of Genesis, and try to understand them in the way that their original hearers would have understood them. And that means we have to kind of pull their world apart a little bit so that we don't westernize or 21st centuryize or Americanize these stories when we read them, and try to understand what it is that they teach us about God and what it is that they teach us about us. As we start today, I just want to let you know something I feel pretty confident about, and that is this, that a long time ago in the ancient Near East, there was a flood. Today, we're going to talk from Genesis 6 to Genesis 9 about the flood. Noah, the ark, the animals, the flood. So most of you have heard this story at some point, whether it was in church, or maybe you saw a movie about Noah, or maybe someone told you about this story when you were a kid. But most of you are familiar somewhat with the story of Noah and the ark. What you may not know is that a very similar version of that story, several versions of it, were told in the ancient Near East by a number of other civilizations, even before, it seems, the Genesis account was written down. And while that may make a few of us nervous at first, I want to tell you that actually it's great that they were, because these stories have a lot of similarities. But the important thing is the differences. So I just want to give you some examples of some of the other stories that were told in the ancient Near East right before we jump into the Noah story, so you can kind of have an idea of what this story is about. I have a friend named Matt Brown. Matt is about 60 years old. He lives in Ohio. He's a pastor as well. I just met him a few years ago. Matt is a very he's a big man, and loves steak, eats a lot of steak. And so first time I met Matt, I was on a trip. It was at a pastor's conference, and we got assigned to be bunkmates together in the same hotel. So I'd never met him before. He told me that night, this was just a few years ago, he told me that night that he sleepwalks. And so if he gets up in the middle of the night, if I would just guide him back to his bed, he'd appreciate that, which made me feel immediately uncomfortable. And so I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. What I didn't know until later is that he's been doing this since college, and the very first time it happened to him, he woke up in college, middle of the night, he's like 20 years old, and he just gets out of bed, and his roommate was sleeping above him. They had bunk beds, and he just pulled his roommate out of the top bunk bed and slammed him to the ground. That was the first time he knew he was sleepwalking. And then I'm like, do you sleepwalk? Or is this a excuse for violence? That's kind of what I'd like to know, right? So that was his first experience. But just a few years ago, he had another experience where he was staying in a hotel room by himself. It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. It was very late by the time he got to go to bed. Falls asleep, and he starts to dream. And he dreams in his dream that he's walking through a corridor, a stairwell, going down some stairs in his church building. And he's exploring, and he's like, I didn't even know we had stairs in this church. And so he starts to look around, and then he wakes up, and he's actually in the corridor stairwell of the hotel room. It's like 4 o'clock in the morning, and he's in nothing but his underwear. And so he's like, what do I do? He's got tidy whities, and do I head down to the front desk and emotionally scar whatever young lady is working the late night shift there, right? What do I do? So he ends up going to the elevator, presses down on it. No one's in it, thankfully. It starts to move, and as soon as it starts to move, he presses the emergency stop. And someone comes up over the intercom and says, oh, sorry, you okay? He says, I'm fine. I locked myself out of my room. I'm in room 326. If someone could just meet me there with a key, I'd appreciate it. They said, no problem. So he goes back up to the 3rd floor, and then he stands next to him. Now, tidy whities, that's all he's got on. He's trying to figure out how not to freak the person out who's coming to him with the key. So he decides to try to hide in the doorwell, right? Just a little bit, bunch himself up against the door as most as he could. Now, he's a big guy. So this would be a little bit like a circus bear trying to hide behind a telephone pole, okay? Like, this is probably not working out really well. He looks down the hallway occasionally. He's looking down, and this young, like, college-age athletic guy in a hotel uniform is walking down. Clearly, this guy's, like, summer job. He does not want to be there. And then Matt can't hold his breath anymore, so he just steps out, and he's just there in all of his glory. And guy walks up to him, doesn't ask for his ID or anything, just unlocks the door and pushes the door open, and then he looks at Matt, and he just goes, "Bro." And then he walks away. That was the only interaction he had. You ever felt judged before? Like really judged? Maybe even rightfully judged, but just like, oh, they don't think well of me anymore. Judgment in our culture is a topic that's almost always portrayed as incredibly negative. We say things like, nobody can judge me, or you shouldn't judge me, or only God can judge me, but we don't actually really want God to judge us either. We hate the idea of judgment. We hate it. Like, it's a whole cultural norm that we do not deal well with the concept of judgment. And the story we're going to look at of Noah and the ark and the flood involves a lot of judgment in the story. So what do we do with that as 21st century people? And before we get there, I just want us to look for a moment at some of the other stories that seem to have preceded it. So here is one from a Sumerian legend about Eridu. It's called the Eridu Genesis account is what it's called. So we read this. Here's I'm just going to bullet point what happens in these stories. See if any of this seems familiar. First of all, the gods, plural gods, determined to destroy human beings in this story. And then secondly, one of the gods, Enki, warns Ziusudra that this is going to happen. So then we have a missing or a broken piece of the tablet. So we're not sure exactly what happens after that, what the instructions are following this flood warning. And then Ziusudra emerges from an ark when we pick the story back up. So apparently, from what we can gather, Ziusudra is told to build an ark by Enki, and therefore builds one, and then eventually comes out of it after this flood is over. And then finally, Ziusudra offers sacrifice to the gods, thanking especially Enki that Ziusudra was warned about this upcoming flood. So that's a Sumerian account. We also have a couple of Babylonian accounts. This one is Atrahasis. And Atrahasis, we read this. Here's just bullet points, right? First of all, the gods determined to destroy human beings. Now, in this account, the reason they destroy human beings is because they've created all these people to serve them, right? To make them sacrifices so they would have food. That's why these people were created. But at some point, these people get very loud. And apparently these gods have a bit of sensory issues, and the noise really bothers them. So they decide, you know what? No more people. We're just going to wipe them all out. So that's the decision they make. And then one of the gods, Ea, ends up warning this Atrahasis. Ea actually is told that you're forbidden from speaking to any of these humans about the flood that we're going to send to wipe these people out. So Ea gets around that by going to Atrahasis' house. And instead of speaking to Atrahasis about the fact that this flood is going to come, Ea speaks to the house. "Oh, house of Atrahasis, the flood is going to come. Protect yourself, house. House, you should be very aware this is coming." Very clever, right? The gods and their loopholes. Very good. So Atrahasis ends up getting warned of this, and then Atrahasis builds an ark. And then the ark is filled with their family and some animals. And then there's a damaged portion of the tablet that we really can't make out. But probably what happens is that Atrahasis offers a sacrifice, because that is how all of these stories seem to end. Here's another one, Gilgamesh. This is a Babylonian account as well. The gods determined to destroy humans. It's the noise thing again. The Babylonians really didn't like loud sounds. They would struggle in 21st century America. The god Ea warns Utanapishti, right? So this is told, so Gilgamesh in this story ends up, he's a king, but he's a bit immature. And then his friend Enkidu, and I'm very, very much shortening this, his friend Enkidu ends up dying, and it grieves him, and he realized that he is going to die one day. He is going to die. So he tries to figure out how he can have eternal life. And he knows there's one human who has become immortal, and that human is Utanapishti. So he goes to Utanapishti to ask, how did this happen? How did you gain the ability to keep on living? And this is the story that Utanapishti tells, that the gods were determined to destroy humans, and then Utanapishti was warned by the god Ea. And then Utanapishti then built an ark to save them and their family, and the ark was filled with their family and the craftsmen who helped build the ark so that they could also help rebuild the world, and then a bunch of animals to save the animals. And then the storm ended, and then Utanapishti released 3 birds at different times so they could check on the water levels. This all happens in the story. And then Utanapishti offers sacrifice to the gods. It's at that point then that the gods grant Utanapishti eternal life, immortality, as a reward for making it through all of this. That's the story that Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh then is very saddened because those were very specific and extreme circumstances, the way that Utnapishtim gains immortality, and he will not have the opportunity to do that. And this is when he realizes that he is going to die. Now, these are 3 accounts. There are more. If you're familiar with Noah and the ark story, you've probably seen a lot of overlap here. But just to name a few similarities for us. First of all, there are gods, or in Noah's case, God, who has displeasure with humans, and that leads to a plan to destroy them with a flood. We're going to send a mighty deluge of water. Secondly, one individual is warned and instructed to build an ark, a large boat. Third, people and animals enter the ark in all of these stories. And then floods rise, then the ark lands. The flood rises, then it recedes, and the ark eventually lands. In 2 of the stories, it's on a mountain. The others, it just seems to be on dry land. And then finally, the flood hero, whether it's Noah or Utnapishtim, the flood hero offers sacrifices to either the god, in Noah's case, or the gods, in the case of all the others. There's a lot of similarity here. But what's interesting isn't the similarity. What's interesting is the difference. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time exploring today, as to why this story is contained in the book of Genesis and how these ancient people would have heard it. Apparently, at some point in the past, there was a devastating flood that happened in the ancient Near East that was passed down through oral tradition. I mean, we didn't even have writing at the time that this happened, so it would have been passed down through oral tradition and eventually written down in these different cultures. These different cultures then are interpreting why these particular events happen. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the other traditions except to kind of like show how the Noah story is different. But if you're really interested in learning a lot more about those, I want to recommend a few books you could pick up if that's interesting to you. The one I recommend far and away, if you only read one, is The Lost World of the Flood by Tremper Longman III and John H. Walton. John Walton is a professor at Wheaton College just outside of Chicago. So these are people who take the scriptures very seriously. And just because they take them seriously doesn't mean that they think that everything is meant to be literal or a beat-by-beat recounting of history. They're trying to understand these scriptures as the ancient Israelites who first read them would have understood them. So these are all great books that you can check out on the book of Genesis or on the flood specifically. If you're more of a movie person, a few films that I think are worth checking out. First of all, a few years ago, Darren Aronofsky directed a film called Noah. Some Christians didn't like it because they felt like this 2.5-hour movie didn't stick closely enough to the Genesis 6 through 9 texts. It only takes you about 10 minutes to read through Genesis 6 through 9. This movie had a lot of time to fill, okay? In the Noah story, in Genesis 6 through 9, Noah doesn't even talk until the very end of chapter 9, when he curses his son Ham for seeing him naked while he's drunk. We don't even have time to get to that part of the story today. So if you want to know about drunken, cursing, naked Noah, come back next week, where we still won't talk about it. Okay, so we just don't have time to get there. But that does happen at the end. So this Noah is not a character that we know much about. So yeah, this is a bit of an taking some artistic license, yes. But a lot of what they capture is pretty interesting. And Aronofsky is a beautifully creative filmmaker when it comes to the visuals. So I just, check this out. It's not for small kids, but I do think that a lot of you would probably enjoy it. Or if you want a more accurate depiction of the book of Noah, there was a movie that came out a few years ago called Evan Almighty. That's a lot closer. Or if Noah makes you want to see like disaster films, might I recommend to you The Fabulous Four? This movie is not about a disaster. This movie is a disaster. So, just there's something for everybody up here, hopefully. But as we approach this story, here's what I want us to think through. These stories that Genesis 1 through 11 are telling, right? They're trying to explain why. This flood story, this Noah story is trying to explain why. In fact, these other Mesopotamian stories, Babylon, Sumerian stories, Akkadian stories, these stories are all trying to explain the why. They are not interested, thousands of years ago, in the specifics of the how. See, we are so used to reading history as a beat-by-beat account of exactly what we would see if we were to point a video camera on it and watch it play out. That's the only way we think of history almost in the 21st century. That is not the way that any of these story creators are thinking of history in this case. There was a dramatic flood that seemed to have killed a lot of people, and they're all asking the same question, why? We still ask that question today. Why did I get fired from my job and she got to keep hers? Why did my son get a diagnosis of cancer and their son is perfectly healthy? Why did my marriage end tragically after infidelity? And their marriage seems to still be going strong. We ask this question all the time. And frankly, the why behind things is a lot more important than the how. And that's what these writers are after. Just something we said in week 1 of this series, which I think is important for us to remember, is that the New Testament gives us principles, right? You have some of the first Christians like Paul or Peter or James, and they're writing like, this is what God is like. These are his attributes. This is how you can live a godly life. Do these things, and you will imitate Jesus in doing these things by showing people your love. It's very principled. The Old Testament gives us pictures. Here's a story of what God is like. Here's a story of what humans are like. Here's a story of the kind of thing God invites us into. So as we approach this story, we need to be thinking through the kind of why. What is this story writer trying to teach us about God? How did these ancient Israelites see this story that survived for thousands and thousands of years, and what did they learn about God and about themselves by entering into it? That's a great question. Now, these writers, what they're doing are giving theological meaning to a known historical occurrence, right? There really was a flood. They're trying to take this reality and give theological meaning to it by the way that they tell the story. This is what Tripper Longman III calls theological history. Now, when we think of history, we think of beat by beat recounting of exactly what happened. Theological history, the emphasis on the theology. What do we learn about God from this story? Way secondarily is it the history. The history, in whatever way it's told and presented, is simply a vessel to carry the theology. That was what was important to them. And so because of that, it means that theological history is different than beat-by-beat recounting of what happened. In fact, theological history often employs hyperbole to emphasize its point. If we come to this story, and I've seen this happen so much over the years, people come to this story, and what they immediately want to do is to fight about the story. Well, was there a real Noah? Did God really command him to build an ark the size of which we've never seen before in that point in human history? Is it even possible to fit all of those animals? Not two of every animal in the world and 7 of the clean ones for sacrifice? Is that really possible? What did they do with the poo? I want to know what they did with the poo. How did they get fresh water into the boat? How, if the flood covered the whole earth, do we now have fresh water and salt water? Shouldn't everything be salt water? There's all these questions that come up. And again, those are interesting. We can talk about it. But the main point of theological history is the theological part. What does this story teach us about God and about ourselves and about how we can live? That's the question. And so as we come to it, we just need to realize there's a lot of hyperbole at work here. And we don't have to get into all the details of like how much is exactly literal versus how much is hyperbole. I'm not sure, but if we focus on that too much, we'll miss the whole point. I just want to give you a few examples of the hyperbole. This is from Longman III and Walton in their book, The Lost World of the Flood. They read this. We contend that employing universalistic rhetoric to portray the impact and significance of the flood, right? Because it's depicted in the story as covering the whole world. Like they're definitely saying this. That doing that as a cosmic cataclysm does not mean that the ancient Israelites or the author considered the physical scope or geographical range to be universal. In other words, this story is clearly written as if the entire world was submerged underwater, but its original audience wouldn't have necessarily believed that that literally meant every inch of the world was underwater. Could have been a local flood, could have been a more regional flood. The point was the devastation of what is happening in the story, not the details of it. That's where this hyperbolic language gets used. In fact, one of the examples they give is the boat. They're like, they don't think there's any way that the ark was actually the size that Genesis says it is, because there was no boat that was anywhere near that size until thousands and thousands of years later. And they say this, it's hard to imagine ancient readers taking this description as if it referred to an actual boat. Another interesting thing, the ark of Noah is almost the same exact size as the ark of the story of Gilgamesh, the ark of all these other Babylonian accounts, the Mesopotamian accounts, right? All the arks were about the same size. Different shapes, but about the same size. They were all basically just way bigger than anything ever had been. So there would have been nothing like it or even close to it in the ancient world. Indeed, it is probably easier for a modern audience to misunderstand the text and take it as if it is describing an actual boat. In addition to the boat seeming like basically hyperbolic, of epic dimensions that couldn't possibly be meant to be literal, there's just the idea that if every square inch of the earth was actually underwater, the earth would basically cease to exist. There's not enough water in the world to do that. Someone actually ran the numbers. So this is R.M. Best. John Walton's quoting him in his NIV application commentary on the book of Genesis. He writes this: the local sea level can rise several feet for a few hours during a hurricane. But if the sea level rose to the 16,946-foot peak of Mount Ararat, that's the mountain that Noah's boat landed on, the ark landed on, for 150 days, the sea would have had to rise approximately 16,946 feet all over the planet Earth. The whole world the sea would have had to rise that much. That would require about 630 million cubic miles of additional water weighing 3 quintillion tons. If you don't do math a lot, like I don't, the translation is just a buttload of water, okay? It's just a whole lot. 3 quintillion tons. The oceans would have to triple in volume in only 150 days and then quickly shrink back to normal. It just wouldn't be possible. He goes on there. Soroka and Nelson, these are a couple of other theologians and mathematicians, calculated that 3 quintillion tons of water vapor would make the Earth's atmospheric pressure about 840 times higher than it is now, and sunlight would not reach the surface of the ground. Such an atmosphere would be incompatible with life as we know it. Okay? So if you want to go totally literal, whole Earth covered with water, definitely above the big, all that kind of stuff, I get it, and many of us were taught that growing up. It just doesn't seem to be the way that ancient people would have understood the story. Ancient people would have understood it as theological history that used hyperbole to make cosmic announcements about who God is and who we are. That seems to be the way they best would have understood it. Now, if your retort is, look, I realize none of that stuff seems possible, but maybe God just did miracles to make it all possible. That's fair, and I certainly can't show that that's not what happened. I'm just trying to understand the text the way that they think the ancient Israelites would have understood the text, which is using a lot of hyperbole. So whether we're talking literal or more hyperbolic, the point of the story is the same, and that's why I don't want us to get super hung up on the details here. The stories are trying to explain, remember, why. Why did this flood event happen? Going back to the beginning of Genesis, I just want to kind of remind you what God was shooting for at the beginning. He was shooting for what is referred to as the Hebrew concept of shalom. Shalom is not just the absence of conflict. Shalom is not just the presence of peace. Shalom is when everything that God has created is functioning in the way that it is supposed to function. Shalom is where there is order in the world and hierarchy within the world, and those things are functioning in the way they were designed to function. That's when the peace and the goodness of God, the relational enjoyment that humans and God get from one another, all of that is at home. Humans are taking care of the animals and the planet. Like, that's the hierarchy that was created within. That's the divine order. Shalom really is just the divine order. And what Genesis 6 tells us, the very beginning of the Noah account, from the very beginning, is that God's divine order, God's shalom, the thing he wants us to invite us into, right? Like the thing we read all over Scripture, right? In lots of different ways it talks about this. But basically, you can search for happiness your whole life. You can search for joy your whole life. But apart from the shalom of God, that you functioning exactly as you were designed to function, within community, within the love of God, like you'll never find long-lasting joy outside of that. And so God invites us into shalom. And when we don't have shalom, our life is much poorer for it. And at the beginning of this story, shalom is not being experienced by really hardly anyone. And so we read this in Genesis chapter 6, starting with verses 1 and 2. And again, we're gonna read some of these passages. We're gonna kind of summarize some of these passages as we go through it. But here we see Genesis 6, 1 and 2. Then the people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. And the sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives. Now, when I first read this in college, and started exploring what it meant, it really messed me up. So what I'm going to do is unpack it for you for just a little bit, mess you up a little, and then we got to move on. So the sons of God, every time it's used in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the sons of God refers to angelic beings. So check this out in commentaries, read the stuff I give you, read other stuff. This is what commentators pretty much universally agree on. What this passage is depicting here is angelic beings choosing to intermarry with human women. In other words, right, there is an order that God has created things in, and at the very beginning of this story, everything is out of order. It's mass chaos, the divine order, the shalom of God, right? What started with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and continued last week as Kenny looked at Cain and Abel, and Cain murdering Abel, now continues to infect even the heavenly realm, as we have certain angelic beings that have chosen to leave their rightful place in the created order and start to intermarry or sleep with human women as well. So we just see story after story now by the time we get to chapter 6 of everything that God had hoped for us, everything he designed us for, everything he created us for is all out of sorts. And that is, this is unfortunate. It's really messing things up. So in chapter 6 and verse number 5, we read this: "The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil." Now again, hyperbolic language. Is it true that every single thing they thought was consistently evil? I mean, sometimes you're just eating lunch, right? Like not every single thing. But what he's saying is like the divine order of creation was completely obliterated. Humans were way far from the mark. Angelic beings were way far from the mark. And what's his response? So the Lord was sorry he'd ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And this is one of the major differences between this story and those other Mesopotamian flood accounts that I want to point out. Like, why are the gods upset in the other accounts? Because human beings are too loud. You're too loud. It's like we're all 8 and 11 years old, right? You're just too loud. You're too loud. So they just wiped everybody out. What's happening in this story? This God's heart is broken. Why? Because he created us for shalom. And we are so far from it that we're taking the whole world with us down a horrifying path. And he so wants us to experience what we were created for, that its absence breaks his heart. Which leads us to the next verse of God's judgment on the thing that's hurting the world, us. And this is the passage where the judgment comes into play and it starts to get a bit uncomfortable. Verse 7, "And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them." He's sorry he ever made them. Why? Because it didn't go the way he wanted it to go for us. We made decisions that prevented that from happening. Now look, this is the verse that we skip over usually when we're teaching this story to young children. We love teaching Noah and the flood to our kids because kids love animals and kids love boats. So we love talking to them about the story. And they're like, oh, look, we have all these beautiful pictures. Look, there's animals 2 by 2. They're all marching in. And kids are like, yeah, we love the flood. Like, so they think it's great. But we skip over the uncomfortable stuff because we don't want to talk to them about a God who wipes out all of human and animal existence. It's uncomfortable. We skip over uncomfortable stuff all the time. A few weeks ago, end of June, it was the last Sunday of June, I believe, and I did 2 services. I did the 8:30 and 10 o'clock service, and I was getting kind of hungry before our 11:30 service here. So my wife arrived for the 11:30 service, and she and I went into the kitchen. I was looking for just something to eat so that my stomach wasn't rumbling, and I found a box of 2-day-old donuts. It even said, like, these were baked on Friday, and I was like, you know what? Any donut is a good donut, so I'm going to go ahead and take the 2-day-old donut, and it'll be fine. So I popped it in my mouth, and we're kind of talking, and I chewed too fast, and it got stuck in my throat to where I could barely breathe, like just a little bit. And I went, and she was like, are you okay? And I was like, just need a little water. So I grabbed some water, and I'm just trying to muster it down basically with the water, and instead it expands the donut in my throat, filling up all of it, and then the rest of the water can't go down, so suddenly I'm like I've got water all over the floor. And she looks at me and she says, do you need me to do the Heimlich maneuver? And I said, like that's all I could get out. Right? So we go over to the trash can and she gets behind me. Now what she knew, my wife's a nurse. What she knew is that back in March, I broke my ribs. So she's afraid if she gives me the Heimlich, I'm now going to have broken ribs. And I say, I'd rather have broken ribs than death. Like that's a better choice, okay? So I'm just doing this, like go ahead and do it. So she does it kind of gently and just the right way, and it just all that junk comes out of my mouth. It was gross. So then I'm about to have to make announcements in here, like it's coming up in like 20 seconds. And so I've got like tears running down my face, my eyes are red, and I look at him and I'm like, do I look okay? And she's like, you look terrible. Wipe your eyes, just try to do the best. So I come in here after a near-death experience. I run up on stage and I come up here and I'm like, hey, welcome to Verve City Church. We are so excited that you are here today. And I didn't mention at all the fact that I just almost died. Why? It's uncomfortable. It's not the best way to welcome people. Welcome to our church. I almost wasn't here. I just had a death attack in the kitchen. It's great. Eat our food afterwards. It's really delicious. You got to be careful about stuff. We skip over uncomfortable things all the time. When we teach this story to people, even when we teach it to adults in church, a lot of times we want to get past verse 7 as fast as we can, and I want you to look at this verse and let it sit like a weight on your chest for a minute. Because God was so brokenhearted over the turn that humans had made that he decided it was better to wipe the slate completely clean, shut down the creation project altogether, than for them to continue going on living life without experiencing the shalom, the divine order of God. Like the pain in this world is too much to bear if you can't even have shalom. And so he decides to just wipe it all out. Now, look, we read this passage with our 21st century eyes. We hear it with our 21st century ears, and we're horrified by it. Like, what kind of God would choose to just wipe out all the people because they're not doing what he hoped for them, right? I mean, some of us have children who grew up and in their teen years, their young adult years, or maybe even right now, you have a child who you love terribly. And you want them to have a great life. You want them to be a pillar of their community. You want them to contribute to society. You want them to be joy-filled and happy. And instead, they just keep making bad choice after bad choice after bad choice. And you've seen them suffer, and you've seen them make other people suffer over the years. And their unhappiness, frankly, has been part of your suffering as well. But how many of us would just say, well, just wipe it clean. Just be done with it then. They'd be better off dead than doing this. And some of you have actually had a child get to a place where they were in so much misery, you actually thought to yourself, you never said it to anybody, you thought to yourself, they might be better off dead. That's the place that God gets to here. That like the world is so far from the divine order I wanted for it, they would literally be better off not experiencing this version of it than to continue to suffer in this total lack of shalom. In the way that the ancient people understood this story, this was not a vindictive, angry God. In fact, it doesn't talk about his anger at all. We think of, oh, the gods are angry. This God is so wrathful, just, I'm going to wipe them all out. He's not angry. His heart is broken for us. This wasn't an act of genocide. This was an act of mercy. That's how the ancients understood it. Now, it may not be our first flinch when we're reading through it, but the way the first people understood it is that this God loves us so much that if we can't attain what he's created us for, it's better that we don't exist. And then this next verse. But Noah found favor with the Lord. Here's what's interesting, though. Noah is not the hero of this story. In fact, Noah's like a blank canvas. We know almost nothing about him. Scriptures tell us that he was righteous and then he found favor with God. In other words, like, Noah found grace. Or, perhaps more precisely, grace found Noah. God extended grace to him. Not because Noah earned it, because there was something in Noah that God felt like could be a spark that turns this around for future generations. So Noah's not the hero of the story. God is the hero of the story. God who refused to allow us to continue to exist so far outside of what we were created to do. God who, in an act of mercy, decided to reset the entire creation project, which frankly can look bad for the creator. Like, oh, you had this plan in place and it didn't go the way you hoped it would, and so now you got to restart over. Maybe that's on you. But actually, like, in his decision to give us free will to choose for him or against him, there was such a tide of against that the entire creation project was set to fail, and God, in his mercy, according to the way the ancients read it, decided to shut it down and start it over, and he used Noah to do it. So Noah ends up building the ark in this story, and the animals board the ark 2 by 2. You kind of know the Sunday school version. They take 7 animals that are clean in order to sacrifice them afterwards. And then you may have, all the questions we talked about earlier about how many could fit on and where you put the dew and all the stuff. Like, okay, so that all happens. Chapter 7 and ate. And then the ark finally lands, the waters recede. And it's just Noah and his family and these animals at this point. And that's where we start to really get a clear picture that Genesis 9 is a lot like Genesis 1, 2, and 3. That this flood story is actually a reboot of everything. And the same thing that God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, he tells Noah and his family, because he's not giving up on us yet. He wants us to find shalom. So we read this in Genesis 9, 1 and 2. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, and he told them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. All the animals of the earth, all the birds of the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I've placed them in your power. That's why. It's not just about hey, dominate those animals. No. I've given you control here. It's up to you to look after them. And God told Noah and his sons, I hereby confirm my covenant. It's the first time the word covenant is used in the scripture. And I confirm my covenant with you and your descendants and with all the animals that were on the boat with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, every living creature on earth. So God's making a covenant with them. This is an agreement. And typically, when God makes an agreement, when God makes a covenant in the scriptures, you have the stronger party, which is God, and the weaker party, which is human beings. And in these cases, the stronger party, God, chooses of his own volition to bind himself to the weaker party, which is us. He says, look, I'm making a covenant for you. Never again, this is the covenant, never again will floodwaters kill all living creatures. Never again will the flood destroy the earth. In other words, the first people who wrote this story down, the theological lesson that they are trying to teach people is God in his mercy reset the project that we might actually have access to the shalom that he wants for us. And he's never going to do it like that again. So if you hear this story and you live in fear that God's just going to smite or that God's just going to take you out like that, that is not the moral of this story. The moral of the story is that in God's mercy, at one point in human history, he was willing, because of his brokenheartedness, to reset the story and re-invite us into his desire for us. Divine order, shalom, perfect peace. So I'm not going to do it like this again, he says. Then God said, I'm giving you a sign of my covenant with you and with all living creatures for all generations to come. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. Now look, it's not that there weren't rainbows before this. It's that he's saying, now when you see the rainbow, I want you to think of my covenant. And he goes on, when I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life. Now, rainbows, right? It rains like 4 days a year here in Southern California, so if you've never seen one, go on the internet, do a search. They're really, really beautiful. But there are other places in the United States that see them all the time. We drove through Kansas this summer for what felt like weeks. And it rains there all the time. So they get a lot of rainbows in Kansas. And therefore, some of the people in Kansas think that they must be more blessed by God because they see his covenant more than us godless Californians do, right? In the sky, the rainbow. But then all they have to do really is look around and they would see that there's not a lot of blessing to be had in this land of Kansas. Driving through with my kids, my kids had never driven through Kansas before. But I tried to prep them like this is going to be a boring day. We had a 12-hour drive through Kansas. We drove all the way from the west side of it to the east side of it after going through Colorado. So they'd seen what pretty looks like, and then we saw Kansas. And so as we're driving through Kansas, at one point, one of my kids in the back just kind of hitting his chest out of boredom. There's nothing else to do. Jack blew his nose in the front seat, and then he just took the tissue and laid it on his lap and was just staring at his snot. And I said, Jack, are you just staring at your snot? And he said, well, it's more interesting than anything out these windows right now. Smart kid. I couldn't even disagree with that, right? So what were we talking about? Rainbows, right? Okay, rainbows. So yeah, Kansas sees a lot of them. We see less of them. But why? Why a rainbow? What's the point of this? What is happening here? When this story is being written down, one of the key pieces of hunting, of warrior equipment, was the bow and arrow. And this was a physical symbol we could see of God who had just inflicted human beings that they would stop their suffering, hanging up his bow. He hangs the bow up and says, I will never use it again. And whenever you see the rainbow in the sky, you'll recognize that I am never going to bring this kind of destruction again. This was a promise. These ancient Israelites, a visual promise, right? They could see in pictures as they walk the earth, a visual promise that God's not going to do this again. But may we learn who God is. He's the God who is heartbroken when we can't live fully into who we were created to be. He is the God who's willing to redo his entire project in order to save us from ourselves. He's the God that will never do it like that again. He has hung his bow in the sky. He's put it down, never to pick it up again. So just a few things as we conclude about Noah. Noah, first of all, right? This is a righteous man who saves humanity through obedience to God. Noah, like as he uses the hammer, right, to build the ark, as he's putting in the wooden pegs, he's designing this thing, building this thing. As he does that, every swing of the hammer is basically proclaiming judgment. It's a reminder to him, to anyone around him in this story that like judgment is coming, the flood is coming, the project is failing. He's gonna have to restart it. Every swing of the hammer is judgment. For Noah, like the ark upon which he is placed becomes a symbol of salvation because it is the thing that saved them and his family and the animals from the floodwaters. That's the symbol. And then the covenant made through him is a permanent promise. I have hung my bow in the sky. I will not pick it up again. Remember, the New Testament speaks in principles, but the Old Testament speaks in pictures. These are the pictures of Noah. And Noah ended up foreshadowing our ultimate salvation that we find in the New Testament, Jesus. Jesus, a righteous man who saves humanity through obedience to God. Jesus, when the hammer is used on him, it didn't proclaim judgment, it proclaimed rescue. I'm sending this man that you might all be saved from the judgment on that which is hurting you. The cross upon which Jesus is placed, it becomes a symbol of salvation. The covenant made through him is a permanent promise that if you want right relationship with God, if you want to experience the shalom and the divine order of life, the joy that can only come from fully living into the person you've been created to be, then choose Jesus. Because the eternal promise and proclamation of God is that I have sent him, not that one man's family might be saved, but that all might be saved. It's amazing that as we look back into these very first stories and contemplate how the ancient first hearers would have heard them, we also see how they might have echoed into the first century. Now, the first followers of Jesus would have re-understood them, would have recast them in order to find Christ in every passage. And that's a little bit about the lost world of the Bible. Father, thank you so much for the fact that you love us, and God, that you are merciful to us. God, when we are far from you, you look to pull us back to you. God, when we have ventured far outside of shalom, your desire is that you pursue us. And so in this ancient theological history, we learn a little bit of your love for us, your brokenheartedness over our inability to live into what you called us to. But God, we are reminded that that is a foreshadowing, a signpost that points to your ultimate solution to our problem, which was Jesus Christ. Sacrifice, Lord, giving of his life, that we might proclaim your promise, that we can have right relationship with you, that we can have your divine order, your shalom, if we put our trust and our faith in him. Thank you, Lord, for your grace and your mercy, but also, Lord, thank you for your judgment. Thank you for judging those things that are actively harmful toward us. We can't do it ourselves, but you have decided through Jesus to expunge those things from us if we put our trust in him. It is in his name that we are grateful for these things.